Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Tonight we face a troubling and all too common problem in relationships: verbal abuse. We encounter verbal abuse at work, in families, from our own partners. We may be verbally abusive ourselves and not even realize it. How many of these phrases sound familiar?
Gosh, can't you get anything ever right?
Why do you always have to do that?
What you talking about? Shut up, fool.
Let's define our terms. Verbal abusers say the things they say for purposes that are quite different from the purposes of typical, normal conversation. Typically, it's a demonstration of power to get and keep the attention of the listener. With us tonight to explain ways to recognize verbal abuse and find ways to disengage from it are Richard Spaeth, licensed marriage and family counselor in Sunnyvale, and Lou Spaeth, chemical dependency counselor with Kaiser. I want to welcome you both to tonight's show. It's a particular treat to have you here together to talk about this topic. I first heard you, Dick, address this topic at a breakfast for the National Council on Alcoholism, and I was quite taken with what you had to say. So I thought we'd start out by maybe taking a look at cues that we might have adapted to verbal abuse and not even recognize it. Let's take a look. Does the conversation sound like a conversation between two friends? Is it easy for you to imagine talking to others the way he or she talks to you? Do each of you show goodwill and an effort to understand each other? Is there any ordering or blaming going on? One of the traits I've seen in my clients around verbal abuse is how it becomes so normal in a relationship, you may not even be identifying it. Did any of those things sound familiar to you?
Oh, absolutely. The couples who come in to my office, I make Patricia Evans' books mandatory reading for most of them, find that they've been conducting verbal abuse and weren't aware that they were doing it.
Okay.
They did know they felt uncomfortable somehow in the conversation that was going on. One or the other was feeling demeaned or discounted or not being heard. And when you listened carefully to the conversation, you found out that they were being put down.
Okay.
And the subtle one was the withholding form of abuse, in which one partner, generally the male, ends up saying absolutely nothing and exerting a lot of power in that process.
Yeah, there is a lot of power in silence, isn't there? How about you, Lou? Do your clients ever talk about this?
A lot, to the point that very often, and I'll speak to women right now, it certainly goes both ways, where they have been in situations for years, probably starting in their childhood, often by father and mother, and going into relationships where to them the abuse is number one, not abuse from them, and are shocked when you pointed out that the demeaning kind of things that are being said to them is not normal and is not necessary, and that they do have an alternative.
Yeah, in fact, I know I've had clients when I've pointed it out to them say things like, well, this is how my whole family talks.
Exactly.
I mean, we're just kidding. We just talk to each other this way.
And that's the biggest excuse from a verbal abuser. What are you so upset about? You're too sensitive. I was only teasing.
Yeah.
And teasing can be a very, very devastating form of abuse, particularly when it's between parent and child.
And crazy making.
It's
because
crazy making,
when you're on that receiving end and, gee, I was only kidding, it's like, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, how come I don't have a sense of humor then?
Yeah. What did I miss here?
Yeah, okay. What about this terms of conversation sounding like a conversation between friends? I mean, is that something that when you talk about with couples, they are able to recognize that, gee, I really wouldn't be talking this way to other people? So there's really two different standards of conversation going on. What's going on in my relationship and what's going on at maybe work or...
Yes.
Although often you find out that someone who's feeling abused verbally in a relationship is also getting abused at work.
Oh, really? Can you say more about that?
Well, it's kind of like being in a victim role.
Okay.
Okay, and I find that people who have the experience one place often have it in the other.
Okay.
And that they're devastated by both, therefore both professionally and personally they have been made to feel worthless.
Okay.
The boss is usually a more demanding and aggressive abuser because they have the threat, do it my way or you lose your job.
Yeah.
Then you're faced with the problem of what do I want to do about that?
Right.
So she goes home and in general asks tells her husband all about it, looking for a sympathetic ear, and it gets told, well, that's the way it is in business. You're too sensitive. Shape up and deal with it.
Yeah.
Okay? And where do you go from there?
Okay, so part of the difficulty with even identifying verbal abuse is how willing so many of us are to feel like, well, if someone's talking to me like that, it's because I'm stupid. It's because
Yes.
somehow I deserve
Yes.
it, or if I was.
deserve.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the first internal reaction. I must have done something wrong to displease my partner. What must I do different? And so they try very hard to walk on eggs, change phrases, change behavior, do a lot of things to stop the abuse on the premise that it's rational and logical.
That's
and it
right.
isn't.
That's a very good point. Trying to make sense out of something that basically has no basis
doesn't-
in sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the power issue in terms of being verbally abusive?
I think that's the point of it all.
Okay.
Even though it's not always done on a conscious level. She points out in her first book about the hierarchical relationships that we're accustomed to dealing with,
Yeah.
where if you're in then a two-person relationship, somebody's got to be higher than the other.
Okay.
And the person who abuses is trying very hard to have the upper hand and control.
Okay.
So you're being manipulated.
Okay, so control is an important
Yes.
issue. Okay.
And defense of their position, to be in power and be in charge.
Okay.
You also see it played out in the family role where the children are model off of this. So they see dad being verbally abusive to mom, mom in turn to oldest kid to next in line, baby hitting the dog, dog biting the cat,
Right.
you know, eating the bird. It's just goes down the whole chain.
Yeah, that somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to have the
Somebody
most
has to
control.
be on
Yes.
top, and you have to treat an inferior this way,
Okay.
okay, and make them feel inferior.
You know, one of the excuses that I've heard clients make about being verbally abusive has to do with, well, it's for their own good. You know, I mean, someone needs to point out reality to them. If I don't tell them the truth, who will? You ever heard that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, and your opinion is the absolute truth.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
So that
that's,
goes
that's
without
the
saying.
answer, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yes.
somehow I feel like I need to impose my reality on other people. Let's take a look at some signs of verbal abuse. We have quite a list here. Let's see, we've got abusive anger, accusing and blaming, judging and criticizing, undermining, threatening, name-calling, withholding, denial and discounting. We'll take a look at some more in a minute. That's quite a chunk
quite
to
a
start
list,
with.
yes.
Okay. In terms of abusive anger, I mean, what's the difference between, you know, feeling angry in a relationship and saying I'm angry, and having abusive anger? Because I know we've, you know, so many of us, particularly in the 70s, you know, we kind of went to the, you know, the healthy thing to do is let our anger out. You know, we need to express ourselves.
But we need to do it appropriately in a way that doesn't damage other people, either physically or emotionally. One of the most common things to do in abusive anger is name-calling, attacking, saying all the things bad about you, how bad you look, how poorly you dress, how you don't have any brains, all that litany of put-downs, in order for the angry person to vent the anger and feel better and feel more in charge.
Okay.
And the normal tendency, if you're not coached otherwise, is to react in kind.
Okay.
Yes.
And then we end up in a power struggle that escalates and doesn't get anywhere, and often develops into physical violence by one party or the other.
Okay, so in fact, what's common is for the other person to be as verbally abusive as their partner.
That's one way to
Okay.
defend yourself, is to counterattack
Okay.
using the same tactics.
It's also interesting when working with women who have been physically abused. And let's say it's 6 months, a year down the line, the bruises have healed, the eye is looking good, the ribs. What has lasted and stayed with those women, which is common, is the words. Because after a while, if you hear the words long enough, on some level you start believing those words.
Okay.
And we have to really start from the get-go of building up someone.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you've heard your life isn't working or you're incompetent enough, it really
begin to
becomes
believe
part
it.
of your reality.
Absolutely.
Especially if this person is important to you for some reason, you feel that you love them, you want to maintain the relationship. If they tell you often enough it's for your own good, that they really love you and are trying to help you, you end up believing it. And some of the abuse is quite subtle. It isn't always in angry outbursts.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things I know mentioned in our list was judging and criticizing. And sort of, again, it has to do with my perceptions are the most valuable. So I believe I have the right, I mean, I think part of that comes with empowerment, doesn't it? Like I have the right to criticize you. I have the right to give you feedback, whether you ask for it or not.
Taking inventory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, how do you work with someone that they're willing to not do that? I mean, that they're willing to say, I'm not going to impose my reality on someone else. I mean, that must be very difficult.
It depends on the individual. A lot of the people I have seen are not consciously aware that they're being verbally abusive.
Okay.
It's a trained behavior that's at the unconscious level, and it's a modeling they do that's been done for them. When it's brought to their attention, this is abusive and this is how it feels, a majority of them stop it, try very hard to change. But there are others who have it so thoroughly ingrained that that's the only way they can survive. You almost have to rebuild the personality and retrain it and get them to stop it.
Well, and part of that it would be the conviction that what you're calling abuse to them is legitimate. It's like, well, I have to do this. I have to tell her how reality is.
And she's a woman, so of course she's stupid and doesn't know how to do things.
And someone has to clue her in. Yeah, oops.
Yep.
You're outnumbered, Dick.
It's okay, I'm used to it.
Let's take a look at the next list that we had here. Some other signs would be countering and arguing, verbal abuse disguised as a joke. You mentioned that a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Forgetting, ordering and demanding, trivializing, blocking and diverting. This countering and arguing one is interesting. Let's cover that before the break. In terms of, what would that be? That would be sort of like yes, but, or...
That's the idea. You think you got it bad, you ought to listen to me, or something. No matter what you say, they have an opinion on it that's different from yours. Yours isn't very good. Again, you ought to listen to me. I know better. This is for your own good. How come you always do that? You shouldn't have to do that. You've fallen into the same trap. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that?
Okay. So it has to do with, again, my willingness to explain things to you in terms of under the guise of being helpful. Let's take a quick break. Stay with us. When we return, we'll learn more about verbal self-defense.